Hi. The next model we are going to explain in this class is neoclassical model of trade. This model stresses differences in relative factor abundance as a driving force of international trade. So, what we are going to do now is to build a very tiny economy, actually two economies, where we will be able to control demand functions, production functions, so production structure, demand structure of the entire economy, and then we will be able to see how the differences in factor abundance between the countries can be a source of international trade. And look, this model is going to take us some time to go through. Because unlike in the previous one, we're going to control everything within this model. We will be creating this small economy so we can actually see what is happening in it. Now, how is it done? Look, we need to specify production functions, demand functions, and everything. And you might ask, is this approach going to be simple? Well, to some extent. In order to make things simple, we need to make a lot of assumptions on how this economy actually are going to work. But, of course, this should cause this will cause one problem, because like if we are introducing so many different assumptions, we can ask whether this is a realistic approach. And of course, look, there is a trade-off between making model simple in terms of math to handle it, and its reflection on reality. But look, what we want to do here is to isolate the basic effects and channels that actually lead to trade between countries. And because of that, we can create this very restrictive construct that will allow us to check every channel in very much detail. But, of course, reality is way more complicated. And of course, some parts of it are going to be unrealistic. But the advantage of this model is that we can later try to see what happens when we relax those assumptions and go start with more goods, more factors of production, more complicated production functions, differences in demand structure, and we can see how this impacts everything that we learn from this model. And this is actually how it's done now by governments and international organizations when they're trying to assess trade. They use so-called computational general equilibrium models. But those models can be traced back to the simple neoclassical model of trade, of course, made far more complex in order to allow for way more different factors that we are going to analyze here. So, even though this model is very, how to say, small in terms of the information that we're going to put into it, it's not a problem, because this actually will allow us to make all our conclusions in a very precise way. Later on, we can make it, we can relax some assumptions and see what happens. But let's start from scratch. Okay, so every time when we're gonna start with some model, we need to start with an assumption. Assumptions that we need to put down first to make everything else feasible. Okay, our model is called 2 by 2 by 2 model. Why? Because in assumptions, we have two countries. Now it's going to be Austria and B, Bolivia. Now, we will also have two goods, so two sectors of the economy, and this is going to be manufacturers and now, the new thing with respect to the previous model, the Ricardian model, we will have two factors of production. These factors will be capital and labor. Now, if we want to show within this model how differences in relative abundance in capital and labor creates trade, we should be worried that we might confuse this relative abundance with differences in technology. In order to avoid it, we make assumptions that we make an assumption that makes a big difference between these and the previous model. Now, technology in both countries is the same. Of course, later on we will add additional assumption that the technology of production of manufacturers and food will be different. And of course, I don't think anybody would expect that the technology used to produce manufacturers will be similar to the one that produces food. But we are going to assume that production of manufacturing in Austria and Bolivia uses the same technology, and production of food in Bolivia and Austria uses the same technology. So, what we can see is that actually technology is the same in both countries. It just differentiates between two sectors within those economies. Okay, now this will make this assumption will allow us to make the distinctions between trade driven by technology differences and trade driven by relative factor abundance differences. Okay, so the next assumption that we're going to introduce are constant returns to scale. Okay, this assumption we are actually introducing to make models simple and easy to calculate. Then, the next assumption is that both there is a perfect competition and goods and factors market. Look, we're also going to start, this is also a simplifying assumption, but those assumptions will hold for autarky as well as when we introduce the trade between the economies. But once we introduce trade, we'll also assume that there is no transportation cost or tariffs or any other impediments to trade that we are going to discuss in detail a little bit later, although I know that Diana already prepared a video about it for you. Okay, so now that we've got this done, the next assumption is about factors of production. So remember that we are dealing with a long-run model. Remember, perfect competition in the long run leads to zero economic profits. But in order to achieve long run, companies need to be able to set both factors of production at level they find to be best, optimal, right? So in our model, we need to assume that capital and labor are perfectly mobile within countries so in our model basically instantaneously capital and labor can migrate from manufacturers to food and from food to manufacturers within Austria or within Bolivia. But we are assuming that capital and labor are perfectly mobile within countries, so we can move them between sectors, but are completely immobile between countries. Okay, now next assumption that also is supposed to make the comparison simple and the model more traceable is that demand structure in both countries is the same. So we use this assumption in order to make sure that differences in demand structure between countries are not the one responsible for the trade flows, because of course the demand structure is important for trade, but this is not something that interests us at the moment. And finally, the last assumption we've got is that available capital and labor available capital and labor, their amounts can differ between countries. Okay, and look, actually, here we will find the key to how trade flows between countries come about. Now, look, this is something that you probably never seen in any other class, because we're going to build this general equilibrium model step by step. And this is going to be a lengthy process in which we will be going through first production structure, then we will go through factors of production in more detail, then we will go to the demand structure. It will take us, let's just say, a lot of time to get there, to get everything we need. So before we actually start building this economy from scratch, let's consider a couple of main results that we will try to derive step by step from the model. First one is the factor price equalization proposition. shows, this proposition basically states that if we have two countries in autarky that do not trade with each other, they have some factor prices, like wage for labor, rent for capital, and those prices can be, of course, different in those two countries. We would expect them to be different for various reasons. But if the two countries will engage in international trade, this trade will, in final goods, of course, just in final goods, will lead to equalization of the prices so basically to rewards to factors of production, wage and rental rate in both countries. Of course, within the model it will happen perfectly, but in reality it is slightly more involved. Okay, then we've got the stopler-samuelson proposition. Okay, and the stopler-samuelson proposition basically states that if we have two goods, like in our model, and price of one good is increasing, of one of these goods is increasing, we should expect that this will have an impact on the reward on the factor of production that is used in production of this good intensively. So the factor of production that we need basically more in order to produce this good. So what we see is that if the countries start to trade with each other, then the factor of production the country is using more intensively in goods that it's selling will get higher reward. Okay, then we've got the Lazarski proposition. Okay, now Lazarski proposition basically say that if one of the supply of one of the factors of production is increasing, then the level of production this will cause increase in the level of production of a good that uses this factor intensively. Okay, so actually you see the proposition basically states that we have more of one factor of production, but it does not lead to increase the production of both goods. It leads to the production, to the higher level of production of the good that uses this factor intensively. Okay, and finally, the last proposition, and actually we can say the most important of all the propositions, because it gives us the main result of the model. It's called the heckscher-ohlin proposition. The heckscher-ohlin proposition is the key proposition, the key result from the Neoclassical model of trade, and it basically states that a country will export the good that intensively uses the factor of production that is relatively abundant in this country. So, if country has capital and labor, but relatively more capital, it should export capital-intensive goods. If the other country is relatively labor-abundant, this country will be exporting labor-intensive goods. Okay, basically this will summarize all the main. This summarizes all the main results, because we will get a little bit more from the model, but those are the main propositions from this model. And in the next couple of videos, we will be deriving them very slowly, step by step. Okay, so from the next video, we're going to start by describing the production structure of the economy. Okay, thank you for your attention. See you in the next video.